That's Tipatat Chennavasin, the general partner at the Venture Reality Fund. Tipatat's not your average investor. This guy's invested in over 40 different XR startups, including big names like Rec Room, the first unicorn in VR, and Beat Games, which was acquired by Facebook. Their game Beat Saber, which is one of my favorites, is estimated to have made over $180 million before the acquisition. Tip's going to share with you how to become the next XR startup that can go to the moon and his thoughts on the Apple Vision Pro. Friends, here's Tipatat Chennavasin. Hey, what's up, Tip? It's great to see you again.
Hey, David. How you doing, man? Always good to see you.
I've known you for a long time, and you're one of the unique individuals in the world that not only is focused in VR, as in XR as a VC, but also a developer. So I'm very glad to be having you as a guest.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I mean, yeah, we've known each other for a long time back when I was doing development on Leap Motion. So, yeah, it's been a wild journey with you, brother.
Do you mind telling people who you are?
Sure. Happy to do it. Hello, everyone. I'm Tipatat Chennavasin, general partner and co-founder of the Venture Reality Fund. We are an early stage VC focused on seed and Series A investing in virtual reality, augmented reality, and artificial intelligence and metaverse. We've been doing this since 2016. I think we're one of the first dedicated funds to be doing this, riding several hype cycles of all of this technology. But yeah, we've been believers since, day zero, and really excited. Through the fund, we've done over 50 investments, and continue to be active and constantly investing. It's been really exciting to see this industry grow.
In terms of this new environment with Apple coming into the picture, I just kind of wanted to help our listeners understand from a VC point of view of your opinion on Apple Vision Pro today.
Sure. I think it's a monumental moment. You kind of think about where this current resurgence in consumer VR really started when Facebook at the time called Facebook acquired a small startup called Oculus, and it was this really interesting moment where software, social media company, thinking about doing hardware, and everyone's like, why? What? This is crazy. Zuck's on this crazy thing. Is this really the future? What's going on here? And then, fast forward, they've done a lot of work, really setting up the first stages of this industry, but everyone's always kind of been a little skeptical about, this is Zuckerberg's, kind of wild, crazy, he's not proven as a consumer electronics, or computing, the brand of Meta, Facebook, was never really known as a consumer electronic company, a computing company. And now to have the world's most influential computing company, consumer electronic company, Apple, the most trusted brand, the most successful brand, the largest, first company, trillion market cap, for them to say, yes, the future of computing is head-worn spatial computing. This is what everyone, everyone in our industry has been kind of aiming for, knowing, but now to see kind of the mainstream kind of be like, oh, maybe it will be oh, okay. There's enough brand equity, there's so much just, deep understanding or trust in both Apple and Tim Cook to be like, yeah, when they say that this is the future of computing, more and more people that were once skeptical are now accepting the idea and being open to it. And I think that's a huge moment for the XR industry. It's validation on a whole nother level. And so, I think looking back at all the companies I've kind of played in these waters, whether it was a Microsoft or even like a Google, even though they have, more, consumer electronics background as well, none of them have that same kind of brand equity, that same kind of, thought leadership in this space to be like, yes, this, when they speak, everyone will be like, okay, yeah, we'll think about this and we'll consider it and we'll line up and buy it in that same kind of.
You're on the front lines of investing in early stage startups working in XR. Can you provide kind of a framework of how you'll be looking at prospects in the future who are developing for Apple's new headset? Are you going to be looking at them differently? Do you have a different framework in mind? Or is it just all the same because the technology is very similar?
Well, I think there is a kind of a shift. I would say, where we've seen, we've always thought of this as a general purpose computing platform, but we've seen, especially what Meta's done with the Quest is really shown that VR in particular can be good for gaming. And yeah, I think it's very important to note, like, what's been successful so far, but also to understanding too, like, but we're still early and still trying to prove out this, thesis that that XR can be more than gaming, and that it can be impactful for productivity and for all of these other kind of general, both consumer and enterprise applications. And I want to say, like, there has been good work, people using Meta and other hardware devices, like in the enterprise, showing applications, whether it's like, uh, doing training for enterprise, or whether it's doing, healthcare work. There's all these different applications that we've been seeing. But what I will say is that, it's still very early in this industry, and what we're always looking for is driver applications. I get this all the time, where they're like, "Oh, I'm excited!" Like, they're excited when Meta was coming in, they're excited when Apple's coming in. They're like, "Oh my gosh, when there's going to be 10 million headsets, I have a great app for that." And it's like, no, 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 no. I'm looking for the people that are making the apps that get us to the 10 million or 20, 100 million or a billion headsets. Like, who's driving these use cases, who's providing the value for consumers and enterprise, building off of the hardware platforms that these huge corporations are building, right? So that's more of what I've been looking for and thinking about, and especially as we talk about, like, I, I don't want to say the future is inevitable, but how do we get there faster, quicker? Who's doing those things that are going to really drive adoption in a meaningful way? And when we look back at the portfolio that we've done, like Rec Room, one of the most successful social VR experiences, first software unicorn. Beat Saber, the makers of Beat Saber, the biggest VR, successful VR game, which was one of the killer apps for VR gaming for the longest time, and continues to be, right? Like, you can see, like, these are things that thrive, that got people excited to put on the headsets. And on the enterprise side too, like, we've invested in companies. They're doing things like, a company we invested in called Proprio. They're doing surgical navigation, which might effectively eliminate surgical error in very complicated procedures. And you're like, yeah, when you look at these technologies, you're like, yeah, there's no other way to do this. That this is going to drive adoption of these technologies, because it does the impossible, and it gives people superpowers, and it's super exciting.
That was fantastic. And your record shows for it. Like you had mentioned, Beat Saber, that was also an acquisition by Meta. Rec Room, they actually have more user generated content than there are apps in the iOS store. And I think they've also paid out over $1 million to creators in such a short amount of time. Now, in hindsight, why did you invest in those companies? Because one's a rhythm game and one's just another social application. Now, in hindsight, looking at those, why were those the best bets?
Yeah, I mean, those were honestly very easy bets to make. Rec Room, a really, really strong team. They were actually ex-HoloLens developers, playing with spatial computing tech, realizing that there's a huge opportunity, especially on the gaming and casual social side, realizing that, HoloLens wasn't going to get there, but that these new, that the Oculus and Vive could get there. And so they wanted to build something, and they were just, you talk to the founders, and the way they thought about what the future could be, the way they thought about game design and spatial, especially social gameplay, and then their execution. Like, I think they built the original, like, Rec Room that launched in the store in like under a couple months, and that launched with, like, full networked physics game with like 4 little mini games, and you could just see that they were just, and they were updating every week, and they're just on this tear of, like, they had something to prove, and they had a really strong vision and knew how to execute. And Beat Saber also too, one of the super easiest ones to do, where you just play the game and you're like, oh my god, this is magical. This is everything that you want from a VR game. It's VR first. It makes sense in VR. It takes advantage of everything that's great about VR, but it's also all those other things about a great game, where it's easy to pick up, hard to master. It's not overly complicated. Anyone could play it. The concept was great, but honestly, it was the execution of it. Like, one of the things that I think that's really interesting about Beat Saber is, like, if you look at it on paper, right? You say, hey, here is a game made by, award-winning mobile game developers, but not like hugely successful mobile game developers, right? Like, but from the Czech Republic, and the music, it's a music rhythm game, where the music, there's 10 unlicensed or 10 songs that you've never heard of, all made by the CEO, and it's a single player, and you're like, is this even, like, how much of a game is that really on paper, right? The specs don't sound that impressive, but as soon as you just play it and you realize what they're doing, it's on a whole nother level, especially the biomechanical design, the way that they, instead of procedurally mapping the game like a lot of other music rhythm games to try to get as much content as possible, they purposefully, like, really thought of the choreography and made it very meaningful and feel very good to play. And you're just like, yeah, these guys are hitting it on all these different levels. And of course, they had that super early viral campaign that showed, like, that they understand how to market. It was just so many things they did right to get this, supernova effect. And it was great because this happened during the VR winter when, honestly, like, there's a VR hype cycle. A lot of investors were looking at VR. And then all of a sudden during the VR winter, when it was seeming like, VR wasn't going to get to 1 billion users overnight, a lot of people left. But as a fund that was focused on this, this is all, VR, AR, spatial computing, AI, all we care about. We just kept looking, kept trying everything, kept seeing everything. And we found that, diamond in the rough, so to speak. But honestly, the company, I think that, not that they single-handedly, but they were a big part in thawing that VR winter. And that was super exciting to kind of, not only get to support them, but, learn, see everything that happened with them and understand, like, they redefined what success could be. And it's been awesome.
That's interesting. I think you're selling yourself a little bit short. I think to be able to pick those specific wins during a VR winter was extremely tough, and kudos to that. Where do you see developers now with this other, I guess, phase of spatial computing? What kind of experiences are you looking for now that kind of capitalize on, like, eyesight, hand tracking, and capitalizing on those additional sensors that Apple's bringing to market?
Sure.
What are your predictions, and what are you going to be looking for?
I think it's really interesting. I think a lot of this too, whether it's, VR, or, whether it's with a Meta or whether it's with Apple, like, a lot of this has been about who understands user interface design the best and who can take advantage of the inputs that are available. So XR is not just what you see, but how you interact. And I definitely am looking to, especially when we're talking about like Apple Vision Pro and what they're trying to do, things are going kind of beyond gaming and thinking about more, consumer, non-gaming, but entertainment focused things or social activities, but also a lot of productivity, wellness and fitness, all these other things that we've seen work well in VR, but could work really well on the Apple Vision Pro. And especially with, like, the hands free kind of with these kind of new inputs that you're kind of talking about. I think it is really strange, not strange, but it's going to be difficult, I think, for a lot of people to kind of get their heads around what a change in paradigm the Apple input is without getting to try it themselves. And so I'm very curious, especially to see, again, not just, and this is very important too, like, when we think about VR and AR, it's so much like how you interact with the world is really the key to it, and the key to, like, really compelling experiences, really engaging and retentive experiences. And what I've been really thinking about long and hard, especially this idea of 3D design, right? And I think we're at this moment where we're seeing this huge demand in the increase in 3D content that needs to be out there for all of these, like, gaming platforms and metaverses and all of these other activities, right? But creating 3D content has been notoriously difficult, like doing CAD, computer assisted drafting, using these 3D modeling programs like Blender, freely available, but honestly, pretty hard to use. I mean, my background is doing 3D design, so I understand those problems very well. But now saying, hey, you know what? With these VR, AR, spatial computing interfaces where you can use your hands, you directly manipulate the 3D world, it feels more like playing with Legos and less like using a mouse and doing drafting. Then anyone can do it. Everyone can do it. And so I'm really excited for this idea of democratizing 3D design, and especially when we're talking about getting generative AI involved, making things where, what would have taken a professional artist, years, with years of training, tons of time to do now, new people can come to this and create. And this idea of, like, when we think about especially platforms like Roblox, right? There's so many 3D developer designers that are trying to do it that are struggling. And if we can unlock UGC on that next level using these spatial tools, I think we're going to see a huge outcome.
That's so true. I think once you experience like being in Tilt Brush and being able to create whatever you imagine. However, the tools still are pretty rudimentary. I can't export that into something a workable 3D model that's fully polished, right? When do
Yep.
you think we'll get there? Like you're at the top of
Well, I
the
think
spear looking at these startups. Yeah.
we're already seeing some of that, right? Like, I mean, like Medium that was done by that was later acquired by like started by Oculus / Meta, Facebook, whatever, and then acquired by Adobe, and now that lives on in kind of Substance Modeler, and that's a much more professional tool. But then there's Gravity Sketch, which works well in like the product design world, and then we have other tools too for like 3D prototyping, like Shapes XR, that are kind of leveling up, kind of going beyond where we started with some of these earlier pools, but also too like thinking back and seeing things like a Rec Room where they're designing in 3D from the get go to build content that exists in the Rec Room platform. So I think there's going to be a combination of all of that. And so I'm super excited. I think it's funny, like, going back to what we, where we first met with all the Leap Motion stuff, right? Where it's like hand tracking, and it was, I would say, like thinking back where hand tracking with 2D interfaces was always kind of hard because it was still abstraction. But now, if it's hand tracking, but then it's like what you see is what you get and you directly manipulate the thing, it's so much more powerful. It makes so much more sense. And so I'm really glad that Apple, beyond just what they showed in the keynote, if you actually look at their developer talks, they talk about, oh, you actually can grab digital things and move it around very naturally with your hands, and and they have the menus that you can point at like that, interact intuitively as well. So I think there's going to be a wide range of interactions within the spatial computing and Apple's spatial computing ecosystem. And I'm excited for the companies that really embrace that, explore that, kind of push that towards how does this increase productivity, not just for today's IT tasks, but for tomorrow's tasks.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what Apple has been preparing for with the human interface guidelines being evolved into the human interaction guidelines, where people are now going to have to understand how spatial and one extra dimension from 2D to 3D, how does that change user interaction? How do they manipulate objects? How do they become more productive by using the tools that they have now with this extra dimension? In terms of Apple's choices of hardware, I've always wanted to ask you this, and I haven't been able to since the WWDC event. Are you happy with the strategy that Apple's going for high-end components? And that also kind of puts them in a box because it also limits how many units they can actually develop and produce?
Yeah, I mean, there's been reports, right? Like more recently too, about like it's so complex that that they're going to have to reduce the amounts that they can promise to the community. But I don't know. I still kind of feel like fundamentally it's the right approach. I'm glad that someone's like, like we have two vectors, right? You have Meta going for the masses, going for the cheapest possible product, or I don't want to say cheapest, the most inexpensive, to try to bring something to the mainstream. But then we have Apple saying, no, like, we feel like this is the minimum bar of quality, and we have to hit this if we want all of that functionality. And I think there's two ways, like when people look at the Apple device and like, oh gosh, it seems very expensive. Tim Cook in one of his interviews was like, look, the Apple Vision Pro does everything a MacBook can do and everything an iPhone can do. And so if you think about that as saying, hey, this isn't a replacement of a game console, this is a replacement of your Apple MacBook, your Apple MacBook Pro, all these other things, then you're like, okay, then that price makes a lot of sense and what they're trying to do and what they're trying to achieve. Now, can they get there? I hope so. Like, it would be great to say, like, is using your eyes and using your pinch a faster way of typing than using a keyboard? Could be. I think if we can prove that, then again, off to the races, right? In terms of like, oh yeah, the value that this provides for so many people. But I also think too, if we think about other tasks, other things like using your hands to manipulate 3D world and doing 3D design, and if this becomes the best 3D design system, then yeah, the 3000 would be a steal, right? Compared to like what it used to cost for getting a good 3D design workstation, especially if people can be more efficient. But then lastly, I do think like in a way, I think it's actually very inexpensive. Like what not just because of the hardware performance and everything, but if you told any iPhone developer right now, hey, how would you have been able to like go into the past, get the iPhone 2 years before everyone else had the iPhone, so you could start experimenting, developing your app, figuring out best practices, and creating the best iPhone app. So when it launches, you'll have an app in the App Store. I think anyone, any iOS developer I know would easily pay more than $3,500 for that.
That is a great customer use case, 100% there. I think that's why even the MacBook was even created just for iOS developers in terms of the features that engineers get to actually kind of appreciate with Apple's design sense. Now, actually talking about design, what do you think is now going to open up in terms of these human interaction guidelines? The way Apple is now going to probably start solidifying what a good UI experience would be, what a good UX experience should be when you're looking at specific menus, and how you should interact with objects. Tell me about what your thoughts are of the future regarding this new paradigm of structuring XR design.
Yeah, I mean, what I really like about it is this idea of like, they're not trying to recreate the present, and they're trying to go beyond it. And so, like you could say like, there's so many different user interface design paradigms that we've seen from both, Meta, Microsoft, and others, and all the game developers out there. They're all kind of grappling with the same, like, how do you make menus? How do you make a button press? All these kinds of things. And what I like, I think for the past, we've done a lot of things that are like, okay, how do we make it very intuitive or rely on what we kind of know, by like saying, okay, can we do almost like skeuomorphic, right? Can we put a screen and there's a button and you press the button like you physically would in real life, right? Which is intuitive, but might not be the most efficient. And so what it sounds like Apple's really done is just focus on both sides of it, not trying to sacrifice intuitiveness and efficiency, trying to make it both intuitive and efficient and making it magical, right? And I love that idea that, at least, in the past, Apple's always done this, like really focused on that wow factor and making it a joy to use their devices and their products. And, I don't want to fault, Meta, like, and Microsoft even too. Like, you look at the technology behind both the Quest or the HoloLens, like, it's amazing technically what they're able to do. But at the same time, like, the interfaces have always been pretty cumbersome and pretty hard to use, especially for new users. And so I really hope that, Apple continues their kind of leadership in UX and usability, and has really cracked it by using this hybrid of relying on eye tracking and doing some basic gesture stuff. So I'm curious to see how it all kind of pans out. And especially as we talk about like more kind of complicated 3D use cases. Like, I think in the keynote, they showed a lot of just like, interacting with 2D, and which I think it would be wrong to say, hey, just because it's spatial, everything has to be a 3D object. I think there is a time and place for 2D screens and stuff, but being able to, interact with all of it will be interesting to see what they come up with in terms of best practices and affordances to make it comfortable and accessible for everyone.
Yeah, I think that's the holy grail for adoption right now, to be honest. I think we've gone through this trial and error phase of VR in the early days just because the technology was so new, the componentry, hardware, and software is so expensive, even for developing, finding the right skill set to develop for XR. But I think what was missing was these design fundamentals that haven't been explored. And I think Apple's really good at kind of benchmarking that. And I'll tell you, my thoughts on it. When I was at the original Meta, the AR headset that Facebook had bought the name of the company, and a lot of the technology and some of even the people went on to Facebook. I also worked at Facebook, but not specifically for that during that period. But I spoke to over 100 different enterprise companies, all Fortune 500. And they all had very similar requests. They just wanted to make sure that they can understand the ROI for XR. And through these exercises and workshops that we would do with these Fortune 500 companies, the biggest use case for increasing productivity was actually just multiple screens and being able to have privacy to work in confidentiality. And it's great that Apple kind of led with that. They said, hey, it's not a full VR headset where you're immersed and it's going to be, fully closed off experience. It's really about productivity and how we can actually have multiple screens just to be more productive, but then also capitalizing on this 3D space. But with all the apps that came before it, I love Gravity Sketch. It's fantastic. But Apple brings in that experience of just finessing that quality of user experience, the way the menus interact with, the way eye tracking might work to pick, pick specific objects or to navigate through different experiences. What do you think about that?
Yeah, no, I think you bring up a good point. I think there's a lot of interesting things about, like how do we, ease into this future, right? And you're like, okay, yeah, not everyone is necessarily going to need 3D tools right away. How do we get something that already improves the majority of people? But the other approach, what I think is also interesting, and what Microsoft tried to do, but I think they ended up, not really pulling off as well as they'd want to. But was figuring out too, like, who else is this really useful for, right? Like, I think part of the problem I have with this vision of, hey, multiple screens is that most people are actually pretty productive already, right? Like if you're already have a desktop computer, you're working in IT, you're doing these things, like for 2D tasks, a 2D screen is fine, right? But then you have to think about, okay, well, there's a lot of people out there that don't like 2D screens, like don't like working at what's traditionally known as a computer, right? Like don't like a keyboard and mouse, don't like staring at a wall of text, right? And so you're like, what would it mean instead of trying to give people more of the same? What if we could redesign what digital economy, IT, tech work looked like, so it had a more natural interface, so more people could do it, and so it was more obvious and less abstract, less confusing for people. And I think that's really the power of VR and AR. So, like, I'll give you a very concrete example here, right? I don't know if we ever talked about this, but this idea, like, okay, if you are a 3D texture artist, you're applying color to 3D objects for video games and film. It's a pretty well sought after job. Well, we'll see if generative AI changes that, but at least for now, it's a pretty well sought after job, right? If you're a digital artist that's applying material, creating textures, doing this kind of stuff, pays very well, right? And most of your job, you're using like a 2D tablet, and you're trying to understand, map in your mind how this would apply into a 3D space. Now, in the real world, if you were like, someone that was applying color to objects like on an assembly line for toys, right? It's considered, a less skilled job, less pay, but it's the same idea of you're applying 3D or you're applying color to surfaces, right? But just one happens to be in the real world, and then the other one happens to be in the digital world. Now, if instead of using a keyboard and mouse and a Wacom tablet, drawing on a 2D surface and trying to map it into your brain onto a 3D screen, what if the digital workflow was exactly like the real world workflow, where you have the digital object in front of you and then you paint on top of that in 3D space? Now the real world worker that colors toys could now color digital objects, and they would go from having a minimum salary job to a $80,000-$90,000 job, right? Like that to me kind of shows that, like, don't address necessarily the people that are already succeeding in today's digital world, but try to bring in more of the people that have been excluded because of the interfaces, because of the keyboard and mouse and the 2D screen being a barrier for them to really get involved with the 3D world, because it's unnatural. I think that to me is an even bigger opportunity.
Hey, Tip, I totally agree with that. Technology has always been able to make democratize access to information. And I think what you're saying is that, hey, with XR, this is also going to open up new possibilities of more people, becoming texture artists or contributing to digital content, et cetera, which I totally agree with. What is this passion that you have with XR? Like, what do you think it'll do to change society? You already named one, right? This kind of equalizes the playing field. But what is your passion around XR, and what else it can do for society?
Yeah, I mean, I think fundamentally, like, this idea that I grew up in an age where computer graphics and computer games were becoming into existence. I remember playing the Atari back in the day, and just to see like how much imagination and creativity are now a big part of my everyday life still. And these are things where in the past are kind of looked down on as being like a time waster, or just as like not really good pursuits. But now the creative industries are really a huge opportunity. And I think there's this inherent joy from creation and for creating something, getting feedback on it, and just letting more and more people be a part of that creative loop, and feeling and having fulfillment in their lives, right? Like, I hope that this idea that, we're going to live in these worlds, these digital worlds that anyone can create, that will allow opportunity for everyone. I'm just super excited for that. This idea that, where you were born will matter less in terms of how successful you will be in life, right? The opportunities that are afforded to you, like, it's true. Like, yeah, you'll still, there's a digital divide, but the cost of all of that stuff is coming down much faster than the cost of many other things that in the past you would need to get a good life, right? And so I do find that super compelling, super interesting, and fundamentally too, right? Like, there's this idea that, yeah, like, so many people, for so many various reasons, right, just don't have the life that they want, or can't get that life that they want, and maybe, and this is going to be super philosophical and weird now, but I've really been caught up on this idea of, like, we're only given one life, right? There's only one life that we can live. But how do you cheat that? How do you live many more experiences than you actually can? And, like, through reading books, right, you can get more experiences. Listening to songs, you get more experiences, right? Watching a movie, you get more experience. Like storytelling, right? You hear other people's experiences. I don't know what it's like to be a firefighter, but by watching a movie, I'm like, oh, I've lived a part of that experience somehow. Games and virtual reality are the ultimate expression of that. That's the ultimate way to live as many lives, as richly, as deeply, as immersively as possible. And I think that's so interesting and satisfying. And what I like about this too, it gives people those opportunities that you wouldn't have in any other context. And yeah, I think about, like, I'm very fortunate. I get to travel the world, talk to all these people. But I think too about, like, how the internet has made that, at least talking to more people so much more, like, so people are so much more accessible now than they've ever been, and that's amazing. But at the same time, like, now with full immersion in VR, we can do that with, like, experiences and all these other things that for so long, with the 2D world, we couldn't really simulate good enough to make it impactful, but now we can, and that's exciting.
That's super cool. That's basically the experiences that you go through in life are really the scoreboard in life, because you only have one. And what you're saying is that XR is almost like a cheat code, because you'll be able to experience multiple lives in a short amount of time frame to increase the quality of your life. That's pretty cool. Tip, I've known you for a while as a game developer, and then getting into XR. And I saw your path, and I know how hard you've worked in this industry, and actually, the contributions you've made to this industry. And then you took a path to VC, to then supporting other developers like how you were. Can you kind of paint a picture of, like, how that even came about from a game developer to VC? That might be interesting to some folks.
Sure. I think a lot of this was, always being curious, always being builder, never being pigeonholed, into, like, one role, learning as much as I can, thinking that, like, working at startups, thinking, oh my gosh, one day I would like to have my own startup, be the CEO, call the shots. But to do that, I need to learn all this stuff, like, outside of, like, my preferred area of expertise at the time, which was, like, art and design. I was like, okay, I need to look programming, I need to know product management, I need to know the business side. So, I try to do as many different roles as I can, suck up as much knowledge as I can from others. And, eventually I had my own mobile game startup, doing it with one of my closest friends from college. And it was interesting where, especially when you're doing your startup, it was so different to be exposed to that world of, fundraising, VCs, angel investors, all of that kind of stuff. And I was, in a gaming incubator. I pitched everywhere. I got this sense of, okay, like, there's so much you can do as a startup. And then there's, this other level at VC where they're also, doing so much, a different kind of role, but in the same ecosystem. And so you're like, okay. And it was really with the Kickstarter. When I saw the Kickstarter, John Carmack saying, hey, Oculus Rift is legit. You should check it out. And
I remember
John
that.
Carmack, the
Yeah.
father of modern 3D graphics, like, okay, if he says something's worth checking out, I will check it out. And I was so glad I did. I backed that Kickstarter, got the first DK1, started playing with it. And it was really the DK2 with positional tracking that really blew my mind in terms of like what kind of experiences you create, and just, nights and weekends, just building fun demos to kind of be like, to impress my friends, impress myself, like, just to see what's possible with this VR stuff. And it was making a simple demo of trying to go into my favorite movie, The Matrix, where instead of watching Neo, I get to be Neo and do all the cool things like, dodge bullets, jump across buildings, making that jump program in particular. I accidentally cured myself of my real life fear of heights. And that was not my, stereotypical aha moment, but that really showed me like, like this changes everything. It's not just about gaming entertainment. This is going to change how we learn, how we heal, how we work. And it was just so powerful that, and also too, even at this early state, even as, janky it was, running off my underpowered MacBook, on a DK2 with like low fidelity, panels, all that kind of stuff, it was still powerful enough that, on nights and weekends, I could hack my brain. So I thought, wow, imagine what millions of developers could do for billions of people with this kind of technology. And especially considering it's going to get better and better, every year moving forward from now, right? So that really got me excited to say, hey, I didn't want to just be another, game studio. I want to try to impact the industry on a whole nother level. So, it was really through the power of the little crazy Matrix demo I made, showing that to everyone, building my reputation there as, hey, Tipatat has this cool, really cool VR demo, and also to like, the way he thinks about VR is very interesting, and that he also can execute on that and like show, what he's talking about. That gave me the opportunity to help run the first VR AR incubator. And so from there, that gave me that platform where, okay, now this guy that was known for building some cool VR demos really starts to understand, he understands entrepreneurship, investors, the investor ecosystem, startups, and kind of translating between traditional investors that couldn't tell the difference between a pixel and a polygon, and could now like help translate in this highly technical world of VR at the time and AR at the time, and that kind of became my superpower there. And so once I got that up and running, I had the opportunity then to team up with my partner Marco and start the Venture Reality Fund, and that was like that big shift of, I think a combination of, for me, thinking about the bigger opportunity where my skills could be best applied, having that advantage of having skills across all of these. It's like the jack of all trades, master of none kind of thing, where I was never successful at my startup. At the same time, I understood the ecosystem, I understood the players, I understood how it all worked. And so I could, figure out a role for myself, that took advantage of everything I've learned up until now and let me execute and really build that brand of like, hey, yeah, this is a guy that understands VR, especially at that early stage when it was still just, crazy Wild West and no one really knew. Like this, even like before the Oculus had even launched, right? Like, so people were still kind of trying to grasp and get their head around what this technology was. And fortunately, I think for me, it's always been this is something I'm very curious about. I've never took this as a job for me. Like, even if people didn't pay me, I would still be like nonstop reading and trying to learn everything I can about these technologies, because I think it's that interesting, that impactful, and I want to play with it. And so I think that's kind of, that, and I think people recognize that about me as well. Like, I meet this with a lot of the other founders that I talk to, where it's like, kindred spirits of like people that are just so excited for this and want to usher in this future that we've always dreamed about, and that where we're here at that precipice, and we can start, chipping away at it and making it possible. And so I think, that's what's been really interesting, for me, working in this space, and kind of seeing a lot of these things, we're like, oh yeah, I think VR could be useful for healthcare. I think it could be useful for education. I think it'd be, and then making those bets and then seeing those companies, grow and succeed and really make a difference, right? Like, yeah. So sorry, I started dabbling
No,
a
that was
little bit, but
awesome.
that's a little bit about that
No, that's
journey, how I
fantastic.
made that transition. I always tell people too, like, I mean, for me, that period where I was making demos just for the love of it, not thinking it would pay off, not thinking it would turn into a job or anything, but just saying, this is something cool here. I want to play with it. I want to show people what I can do with it, and I want to get feedback, and I want to learn, and I want to make my stuff better. Like that, being in that environment, that was the best, like, one of the most exciting times for me. And at that early stage of VR, and meeting folks like you and others that were out there, getting feedback, learning from you guys, and oh, what are you doing? Oh, this is wrong. How do I fix this? Oh, what can I do? Like, and everyone's so collaborative, and everyone's just so excited to just see stuff being made and trying everyone's stuff. And I mean, to me, like, it's so funny to think like, oh yeah, that was like 6-7 years ago, 8 years ago now, but like that still seems like yesterday to me, and it was just so exciting, and it still is, right? So
I think what you just explained is a playbook for anyone interested that might, seen Apple's announcement that wants to get into XR, or you're an iOS developer. But that playbook of just, first of all, just being passionate. I think there's, in terms of anyone who's as passionate XR, you're on the top of my list, the top 10 actually, probably top 5, and it's your tremendous work ethic, Tip. I think that's also your superpower. I've known you for a long time. When you do something, you go 100,000% at it. I mean, even just cataloging food. I think that's what I enjoy about you most. Is we eat a lot together. We eat at good places, but just following your social posts and all the exotic foods that you've eaten. Just to change subjects, what's the best thing you've ever eaten and why?
wow, that's a tough call to say. I mean, there's so many, and different vectors around that, right? But I'll say, like, some of the most memorable meals I've had, like, I went to this place in Tokyo. A partner, one of our business partners, had taken me to, and it was, I guess, like an invite only kind of place. And at the time, I'd never been to a place where I've had yakiniku, which is like Japanese barbecue, but this was a high end yakiniku omakase, and so it's like a set course. And they just have all these different like cuts of beef, and it was meat heaven. And it was just like every single course delighted me, impressed me. I didn't realize meat could taste like that, could be that soft, could be that, unctuous. Like it was just, one of the highlights. And I think for me too, also just knowing that I was having this was with a business partner, and we were talking about virtual reality, things I love, and then eating this amazing meal. I was just like, wow, I can't believe how lucky my life is. But at the same time, the other one I highly recommend. Like, I'm a SoCal kid, so there's a place every time I go down to visit my dad, my family in Orange County, we drive up to Roland Heights to eat Newport seafood, and it's this Chinese seafood, but done like Vietnamese style, and so it's like extra flavorful, extra just so well done. Their house special lobster. I just went back down for 4th of July weekend to see my family, and of course I had to eat there. And I think that would be probably one of my, like, that with the boloklak, like the French beef, cube beef, like, is like the best surf and turf combo that you will ever have. And to me, it's one of those, like, it represents family, like like eating meals with my family, but then also too just substantially good. And I've been all through Asia eating amazing meals, but like I always kind of come back to, like, that's one of my, like, home base, like, oh my gosh, I love this meal. I want to eat it every time I'm in SoCal.
Well, what's the name of the place again, so I can check it out?
Newport Seafood. Yeah, we'll go sometime, man. Next time we're in
Cool,
SoCal,
cool.
let's hit it up.
So is it a Chinese owned that lived in Vietnam that did a Vietnamese twist? Because that's what a lot of,
I think it's Vietnamese. It's Vietnamese cooking Chinese food, right? Like that's
right. Okay, cool. I like that. I like that. So
that's like how Koreans have their version of Chinese food, right? Like it's like that same kind of stuff. It's like the Vietnamese version of Chinese food, right? Of Chinese seafood.
Yeah, you're talking about, like, in Korean culture, like, there's Chinese restaurants. Like, when you go to Chinese restaurants in Korea, you're getting that interpretation from a Chinese person that probably immigrated to Korea, and they decided to have their own type of dishes, but they had to cater to the audience. So there's like dishes like jjajangmyeon, which is like a noodle black bean dish. But Koreans, it takes the palette of Korean food, but it's a totally different twist to it that's purely Chinese, which is or Chinese fusion, which is pretty cool. I love that stuff.
Yep,
hey,
exactly.
Outside of food, switching topics, switching gears, getting back to the podcast, like, what are your predictions now? If you were to give kind of like tips, prediction of developers should be really thinking about these type of experience zones, Apple headsets, can you name a couple of them? I'll tell you mine after yours.
Okay, sure. Well, so I think one thing I'm thinking a lot about is especially when we think about, like, what does it mean? What do we use these devices for, right? And I've always kind of gone back to this idea of, like, if a device is a gaming console, it'll sell hundreds of millions of units. If a device is a productivity device, it'll sell a couple billion devices. If a device is a communication device, then it sells, 8 to 10 billion devices, right? And so that idea of like, what are the applications within those roles that will help really broaden that ecosystem or prove out that it can be a productivity device and it can be a communication device, and what are the activities you want to do? And I think, fundamentally, right, like memory capture, how do we like things like food, right? Like how do I share that amazing meal with you visually in a way that feels like you're there and you're almost tasting the meal, right? And you know me, I do love my food photography.
I love that.
But I've also been playing a lot with 3D scanning using
I know.
nerfs, which is kind of like a kind of new neuro rendering technique that uses AI. It's a kind of AI photogrammetry, and you just get these amazing results just taking pictures from your cell phone. And I love playing with those kinds of things and seeing what's possible there. So I definitely think things that play with those fundamental human activities of capturing and sharing memories, or meeting and socializing with other people, right? Hanging out with people, having activities to do that could be like more casual gaming, but could be beyond that, right? Like, think about the other behaviors, definitely, listening to music, hanging out with your friends, going shopping, thinking about all of these other activities that we do in our daily lives, but how do we make it better? And especially, I think, the activities that haven't worked well in the current internet or the current 2D, desktop mobile computing world that we have. Like one crazy example I'll give you is dancing. So this idea that if you like to dance, you'll probably you want to take dancing lessons, right? I mean, you could watch YouTube videos and try to teach yourself from watching YouTube, or but especially if you want to do something like ballroom dancing, right? Something that you still probably want to do in person. Well, potentially in spatial computing, right? You could actually like learn to do ballroom dancing and do ballroom dancing classes and competitions with other people if the body's being properly tracked and we're getting all of this data, like, and that would open up this huge opportunity that again has been kind of hard or impossible to do in today's current technology, right? So thinking more about those kinds of activities, like what would it mean? Like I do like this idea of, I love cooking. I watch a lot of cooking videos, and this idea, oh, well, if I can put on a headset and I can watch the person cooking right next to me, I could copy their technique and I could see it from all the angles. Like that would be fantastic. I would love that. And so I think there are these ways of like thinking about, what are popular activities that we do now are pretty good, but can be transformative if it was spatial. I think when we talk about shopping, I mean, everyone's looking, used to like online shopping in a certain way, but when you go to a high-end boutique, the experience is just so much better and so much more interesting. And so can we bring more of that experience into, e-commerce shopping potentially, right? I think all of that, and even, just those like other things of, I think virtual tourism, connecting with other people, that stuff still feels very like, not really, I mean, definitely connecting with people feels great, like, through FaceTime, but like looking at Google Maps, looking at Google, I still don't get that strong sense that I'm actually there and experiencing those things. But now with really immersive, maybe we can get there, right? So I think these are some of the areas when I think about like, what are fundamental human activities that we do that could be, much better in a spatial context.
That's super cool. I just have some ideas. Don't know if these will fly, but
you? What you got?
I think I think there's going to be a couple things that emerge with the Vision Pro. One, you're going to see a lot of games that utilize hand tracking. I worked at Leap Motion, focused on hand tracking. The tracking on that device was very rudimentary. It was 2 monochromatic cameras, not even color, tracking your hands with software determining what your hand poses were. And it was really magical once you add that experience, right? But with all of those noise and occlusion, or maybe a difference in skin colors, when you got lost out of that immersion, game over, right? But I think with Apple, with the amount of sensors that they have, with the fidelity that they are doing tracking, with even micro gestures with your hands, you're going to see a lot of hand interaction type of experience come about. So just with games, you're going to see Beat Saber on steroids, but you got your real hands. You're going to be making and modeling things with your real hands. I think those are going to be cool. I think with eyesight specifically. I think no, going to the actual personas, the avatar. I think you're right. Communication is going to be huge, and I think there's going to be a lot of experiences, whether they're mini games or whether they're deeper experiences with conferencing in with personas. I think that's going to be really big, and I think obviously you're going to look at everything in the Apple's widget ecosystem and figure out what were the winners there to get you more productive in 3D space. And I also think self help is going to be really huge with the Apple headset, just because that you have that whole mixed reality and the camera pass through just looks dynamite, where it actually looks like you're actually looking out into the real world. Those type of things are going to be really taken off. That's really cool, Tip.
Yeah.
And in
I mean,
terms,
I think some of the other things too, I'm super excited about is when you apply all of this stuff too, and you add that layer of generative AI, like natural language processing, all these other things that are just, are really maturing and being higher quality, where now you can have like, virtual pets that are really, really interesting, compelling, but virtual tutors that can teach you all of these things that are specialized in the way that you like to learn, take your best habits, really help you out there. But definitely a lot of the things that I think could be really interesting, are a lot about this, like not just, the VR AR, but also that AI component, right? Which has always been a big part of, what we believe is the core here.
Yeah, it's a holy grail. But is it still too early? Because generative AI, that also deals with a lot of privacy concerns, and also like who actually owns this content. Does Apple jump in? I mean, I don't think Apple is going to be like, yeah, with the dev kit, we're going to also offer an SDK that is going to incorporate OpenAI, or am I wrong?
Well, I mean, fundamentally, right? Like OpenAI will offer these things, or like others will, right? Like, I mean, I think there's tons of companies that are figuring out a lot of these issues, especially like, copyright and all this kind of stuff. We're seeing, again, like Adobe, they have, their own kind of art generation that's all based off of copywritten, like properly owned images, right? So there's so many different ways where a lot of these issues will be resolved. And I think it's important to think about, like, these aren't things that are happening in a vacuum. These are all things that are kind of interconnected to each other. And especially as we talk about the bigger ideas of like the metaverse and, user generated content and allowing more people to become creative, I think these are going to be kind of essentials, elements, all of them, using them in tandem. And so I'm excited for those ideas. And also too, like, we talk about, especially, you kind of mentioned gaming. One of the things I think that's interesting about gaming is it's always been driven by what the input is, what your controllers are, how you interact with the world, and which is discrete button presses, like, okay, movement and then action. But now with, generative AI and with these, like, better better input, like, eye tracking, face tracking, voice. Now we can have games that are driven by the nuances of real life interaction, and not just this like discrete digital button presses, right?
Right.
And so we could have a game that's based off of, and we've talked about this in the past, right? But like a game that's based off not just on what you say, but how you say it. And that's really compelling.
It's just the human interaction.
I think, understanding that yeah, exactly. The more we can get the digital world to interact naturally like the real world, I think the more compelling experiences we're going to have, and the more accessible experiences we're going to have as well.
We're at a different time now, and you mentioned some of this early on in the XR history, or the rebranding, right? Because XR has been around for quite some time, but when there was actually a lot of interest with what Palmer had provided with that DK1, that developer kit, it almost feels like we're going through that excitement phase again, where I think once Apple starts providing more tools and more example code for iOS developers to kind of get really excited, I think you're going to see a whole new wave of developers getting into XR. But in the olden days, it was kind of easy, right? You had mentioned some of that. We would check out demos, we would give feedback. There was already forums like SVVR, Oculus Connect. These are conferences and meetups that were popping up around the world, like kind of generated that excitement, show and tell, very early, kind of like hacker garage type of feeling. But now with Apple into the fold and the XR community matured, are we going to get to that magical moment that we experienced in the old days? Or do you think it's kind of evolved, or it's a whole different way or new culture around XR development?
Well, I think it's interesting too. Like, I mean, I think you bring up some good points. I think it's going to be different, but it's going to be bigger, right? Like, I still think going back to this, where it's like everyone that jumped in because Oculus was bought by Facebook. We were still it was still kind of like the crazy dreamers. There's still a lot of like naysayers, but now Apple saying, "Hey, yeah, this is it. This is the future." I think everyone's like, oh, "Okay, yeah, like this is like." Everything we were doing was leading up to what we knew was going to be this moment. And so now this was kind of the warm up. Now it's game on. And we're going to see it at a whole nother level. And what I like is, we're also a lot smarter. We know what works. We have almost 10 years of really like great war stories, great learnings about what can work, what can't work, and why. And I think that's super interesting. Right. So like, the way I've kind of viewed it, and this is, it's been tough for a lot of developers, like that's the thing. I hear this every now and then where it's like, okay, yeah, no, like now's still not the right time. Now's still not the right time to jump in. It's like you're either too early or too late. And for me, I'd rather be too early and learn and get myself in the right position than to be too late and just, shut out of the conversation. So I tell people, nothing is ever easy, nothing is ever guaranteed. But at the same time, your best chances are if you jump in sooner rather than later. And what I feel like too is there's some people, that jumped in early and are a little bitter and jaded. Things haven't really worked out. But at the same time, if you told me, that me that got the DK1 and was like super excited, but also nauseous by how bad the DK1 was, that Apple's releasing their headset in 10 years, or 8 years from now, and that there would be something called the Quest, and it would do everything you want for like $499. Like I'd be like, what? That sounds insane! I can't believe that. So like I don't know, like it's still like when I play a great VR experience, I'm still just like blown away, and I still can't believe that we have these things. All right, like so. Yeah, man. I forgot what we were going with this,
No,
but
but that was great.
I
That was
think it's never
great.
been a better time for this ecosystem, and I'm super excited for what comes next, led by Apple.
Yeah, I think you mentioned a couple of points that are really important here. Like, look, this is the next iPhone moment. And for developers, if you want to get in, this is the perfect time. There's already playbooks that have mentioned, like even to get, from the DK1 days to the Quest, follow that as a playbook. But now let's take a couple steps back in terms of that first step. What are tips, advice, and framework for Apple to notice you as a developer to get an early access headset?
Go viral, go viral on Threads. I guess is now the new Twitter.
Okay.
But no, put your stuff out there. Just
Yeah.
again, like I always feel like this is the right thing. Is go out there, meet people, go to the meetup, show people what you're working on, get people excited for what you're working on, right? And try different things and experiment and push the boundaries, right? And what I really think is interesting too is that there's never been more people excited about this space than ever, more people that are developing in this space than ever, and get the feedback. But try everything too that's out there. Like I think it makes sense. Anyone that's interested in Apple Vision Pro, like before you get that, get the Quest. Start playing, start seeing what's in the library, learn from the lessons that are out there, right? It's all just free learning for you. Try every single app that's related and unrelated to what you're working on, because you never know what ideas will be out there. And so, I think especially when it comes to things like, XR, I do think too, like unplugging from the computer and trying things in the real world and seeing how that, like, why does that work? Why is that good design? And then trying to apply that to what it would be like in a spatial setting. Because I think, what's more interesting about VR and AR is, like great design has more relevance to the real world design than it does necessarily to like the computer interfaces we've had up until now.
That was wonderful. What advice would you give for Apple trying to recruit the XR community, or at least have goodwill to ensure that there's a bigger community that Apple can bring in? What do they need to do in terms of advice from your standpoint to get XR developers really stoked?
I mean, definitely give out headsets. The more developer devices you can give out, the better. Like, to more, especially, like I think a lot of it, like, it's interesting. I think Apple's just in a very different position. They don't have to, because people love and know Apple and Apple the brand, so people line up to pay X amount, like whatever they can, just as long as they can get access to it. But I think the couple of things I would love to see Apple do, definitely, like having toolkits, having interaction design kits, not just even guidelines, but actual code, like having it like wrapped up in ways that are more easier to develop with. Like, the fact that there still isn't a unified, like, SDK for picking up and grabbing objects and passing it on to another player, especially in a multi-user session, right? Like, I wish those, like, some of these things, like, we know how it should feel, and it shouldn't have to be reworked every time a developer wants to create a game. That they have to figure out, oh, what does it mean to pick something up? What does it mean to like so start like figuring out some of those and making it and wrapping that up in a way that's more accessible and easier for people to kind of get their hands around. uh and I think also too, like, we'll see what happens here. I think this is one of the trickier parts. You kind of mentioned this as well, where camera access, like, this is kind of one of those tricky parts, especially when it comes to privacy, right? But to do a lot of the cool AR things that people are imagining, people want camera access. But for privacy, a lot of the device companies are like, no, we can't give you complete camera access when and there has to be some kind of obfuscation layer, because they don't want bad actors going in and scanning what's in people's houses and doing bad things with that kind of information. So I think that's going to be interesting to see how that gets kind of sorted out. I think the other things I think that could be very interesting, like Apple, I think going without a controller makes a lot of sense. But at the same time, just like how the pen is so important for the iPad ecosystem, I think having 6DoF controllers for productivity applications and for gaming will be essential. So for having an optional 6DoF controllers, might not have a joystick, could be simpler if they were like hand tracked rings, or but some kind of discrete input device that would give people that same kind of 100% reliability that a hand tracked hard controller can do. I think will become very important. And so I would love to see Apple, not necessarily as a, hey, this has to be packed in, but as an optional, if you want to do these productivity acts, just like if you want to do the art apps, you want the Apple Pencil, right? Like that same kind of thing. Or if you want to play some of these all these great games that have been available in VR for a while, that wouldn't necessarily make sense hand tracked. Well, here's an option as well. Right? I think that would be really great to see. The other things, definitely developer support. Like, it would be great to see a developer fund, all these kinds of things, but I don't know, it's Apple. They don't really have to necessarily do that. I think the developers will be lining up anyways.
Yeah, you got to put good point there. In terms of new investments that you might be looking for developers building on Apple Vision Pro, what are 3 things that you're going to be looking for?
Well, definitely, I think, XR first. Like, why does this have to be in spatial? Is this the best way to do it? Is it super compelling? Yeah, and again, is it transformative, or is it just additive, right? And so, which are the ones that are really transformative? And then, and one of the things too, I feel like into this is like, what's providing real value versus novel, like novel value. Like, I think especially in a demo format, you try something, oh, this is a cool demo, but then you're like, okay, well, would you actually use this daily? Could this be a habit? And I think those are the things that we're trying to look for, right? Like, what's going to actually have long-term users, provide enough value that would justify not just the cost of your software, but the cost of the headset as well. I think that's going to be interesting, right? For the longest time, I told people, it's like, especially if you're doing these driver applications, you're not convincing people to pay the $50 for an app, or $20 for an app. You're convincing them to pay the $400 to get the headset and then the $50 for your app, right? And now, with the Apple Vision Pro, you're like, okay, now you have to convince them to spend $3,500 and then your app, right? So that's how I would think about in terms of like, are you providing enough value for your users? And so there's a lot of these cool, novel ideas. I mean, even the cooking thing might just be like, oh yeah, that's kind of, but I wouldn't really pay $3,500 for that. But would you pay $3,500 to have a personalized private tutor? Yeah.
Yeah. Or a 3D camera that you can the quality and fidelity looks so great that these are memories that you can relive when the technology even advances. Maybe they become holograms and you get to interact with it one to one. What are tips? Like, the reason why I do the VR report, and I'm also trying to encapsulate in time what's happening in the space. What are 3 predictions that you see now with Apple Vision Pro coming into the market for XR?
Well, I think what's interesting, I still think the Vision Pro is still like, it's not the mainstream moment yet. I think that'll be the Apple Vision, right? A cheaper, more consumer-facing device that's going to come out, hopefully, in 3 years' time after the Vision Pro comes out, right? That's the one I think is going to be really, really, super compelling, and that in the meantime too, like I tell developers, like focus, like the Quest ecosystem, tens of million devices, $1.5 billion app store. There's still a lot of money to be made there. And so I think the best developers for the Apple Vision Pro, I still think, will be people that have kind of come through the Quest ecosystem and have really understood what it takes to create spatial experiences and applications. So, I'd say, in the short term, think about making things a success on the Quest with an eye towards the Apple Vision Pro and that, or Apple Vision ecosystem. The other things definitely thinking about are, like using more of these, new technologies, whether it's nerfs, SDFs, generative AI, in interesting and compelling ways that make sense, right? And I think this idea of, like people always ask, like, is there a killer app? What's the killer app? To me, I think the metaverse is the killer app for spatial computing, just like the internet was the killer app for desktop and mobile, right? Like, if you don't have, interconnected, social 3D worlds where millions of players are interacting with one another, it's, to me, that just sounds like something not only that we want, but something that just makes a lot of sense for so many people. And I think, but the challenge is, though, the way I described it is pretty generic still, right? You still have to think about what's the functionality for the people. Can't just be the tech stack. It has to be the functionality. And you have to say, is it providing more value than today's 2D internet, right? But when I look at these things, like I definitely am still so blown away. And I think that Roblox is still one of the most underrated, under talked about companies, where you're like, look, this is a proto metaverse where, 3D interconnected digital worlds where over half of the kids in America daily are meeting up with each other, playing games together, but more importantly, buying and selling digital experiences that they've created for each other, right? And, this is where they're going to their first concerts. This is where they're getting some of their biggest, like, brand loyalty. And it's interesting where, I feel like gaming has taken over entertainment in terms of being the most time spent, but also dollars spent, right? And it's the most important entertainment leisure activity there is, and it's not slowing down, it's not stopping. And I think it's interesting to me, like that idea too of like user generated content and letting more people participate in deciding what kind of games and stories are being told is exciting. And I'm hoping that we really, in 5 to 10 years, we are in a place where, there is less gatekeeping, more interesting, tailored experiences that people want to do, and at the same time that it's fulfilling, that people feel like, like they are having a good life, a great life even, right? Because of the digital experiences that they've had, being a part of the metaverse, meeting their friends, hanging out, saving the universes over and over, and all those kinds of things, right? Like, I think that, like, to me, that's going to be a good time.
Those are great predictions. I think I have one that came up from this conversation, is that I think the most innovation that will happen after the release of the developer kit of the Apple Vision Pro is there are going to be a lot of people that jailbreak them, and there's going to be new innovative ways that people have never thought of before that's going to come out from these different XR experiences. Tip, you were great. You were fantastic. I know I took too much of your time. I knew you had a short schedule, but any other parting words or where people can find you?
No, well, again, thanks for having me. I love this conversation. It's always a good time we get together and chat. Find me, on Twitter or Threads at Tipatat, Tipatat, or reach out to me on email, tipat@thevrfund.com. Again, always happy to chat with anyone that's interested in this space. And good luck to everyone out there. Just just build something amazing.
Thank you so much, Tip. That was great. Thank you.
Thanks, man.